If you're a fan of the channel, then you probably love classic domestic vehicles. And these cars generally are great. It's pretty amazing that, frankly, they function almost like new if you have one in nice condition, despite the fact that now many are 40, 50, even 60 years old. And that just speaks to the overall longevity as well as the reliability of the engineering that was generally employed at the time. Now, what we're going to feature here today are not some of the best ideas from the domestic auto companies, but in fact, some of the worst. And this is a list based on my personal experience of owning lots and lots of classic vehicles. But feel free to put a comment in the comment section if you feel that I've missed something here in terms of the worst ever features, and perhaps I did. But share it with everybody else. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have the power door locks that Ford and Chrysler used on many of their vehicles. Now, power door locks were something that were often found on luxury cars, and many vehicles of the era had power door locks, particularly the GMs, where you had a switch that was on an armrest or in an easy location where you could lock and unlock the doors. However, for a period of time on some Ford and Chrysler models, the way that you would activate the power door lock was by pulling up on the lock plunger or pushing it down, depending upon whether or not you wanted to unlock or lock the doors, respectively. So, in other words, you would come up to your car if you were outside of it, unlock the door. Then if you wanted to unlock all the rest of the doors, you'd pull up on the lock plunger, and that would activate the power door lock. And likewise, when you're exiting the car, if you wanted to lock all the doors, you would push the button down or the lock plunger down, and it would lock all the doors. So what's wrong with this? It sounds relatively reasonable. Well, imagine for a moment that you're inside the vehicle and you want to lock the car, particularly if you have a two-door coupe like my 72 Mercury Marquis Brougham. If you want to do that, that means that you have to abnormally reach all the way back and push that lock plunger down in a completely unnatural position in order to lock both doors. There's no other way to do it. Then if you want to unlock the door because a passenger wants to get in, you have to kind of contort your arm and reach back and pull up on it. This was just not a good setup. And again, it was particularly bad on the coupes. The sedans you could kind of make do with because the doors were shorter, but on the coupes, that lock plunger was pretty far rearward. And the only way to operate the power lock was to do what I just said. And I just think that was a bad idea. Strangely, Ford had this on some early 70s cars like my Marquis Brougham, as well as my Lincoln Mark IV, my 72 Mark IV. But my 69 Mark III does not. It has a normal power lock switch on the armrest. So go figure. Not quite sure why or how Ford decided where to put theirs, but that's what they did. And I think it's kind of an unfortunate feature, but why did they do that? Well, most people, when they were driving their car, didn't lock their car door, so they thought it just wasn't a use case. Remember, this was the 1970s after all. So that's number 10 on the list. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have something that made cars look cool in this era, but really was a functional challenge in a number of ways, and that is the hidden wipers that many of these cars have. Now, hidden wipers were something that you saw in a lot of vehicles in the late 1960s through the, let's say, mid-1970s. And you saw them on some vehicles outside that window too, but that was when they were most popular. And it seems like a good idea. You have the wipers kind of tucked away underneath the hood. That way you don't have the clutter of looking at them, and also protects them from the elements. The problem is, imagine that you're driving in snow and think about how these wipers are activated. In particular, the passenger side wiper wipes that portion of the windshield, pushes it to the middle of the windshield, and then the way that that ends up getting cleared is when the driver's side wiper comes and pushes that down. And so you have each swipe, imagine it's snowing, you have the snow that gets moved from across the passenger side of the glass to the middle of the windshield, and then the driver's side wiper pushes it down when it makes its movement. So the problem with that is if you're driving through heavy snow, you'd often get this buildup of the snow kind of packed down in the area in between the bottom edge of the windshield and the hood where the hidden wipers would tuck under. And this is one of the reasons you'll see a lot of classic cars today, in terms of ones that at least were driven in the Midwest at some point in time in the snow, you'll see the driver's wiper is a little bit misaligned. It's just slightly up versus the passenger wiper. And that's because the linkage is out of adjustment, since that wiper arm has been trying to push the snow down into that area, and it just can't. Whereas the other side doesn't have that problem because it's not trying to push the snow downward. It's just moving it toward the middle of the windshield. So oftentimes, while it sounded like a good idea, the hidden wipers actually hampered the ability of drivers in the snow. You have to clean out that area. There are lots of different funky hidden wiper setups too. I mean, most of them are pretty conventional, but the Corvette of the late 1960s to early 1970s had, I think, the coolest hidden wiper mechanism, but it was certainly complicated, and it kind of had to lift up this portion of not the hood, but ahead of the hood in front of where the hood meets the windshield, would lift up, and that would reveal the wipers. Well, imagine that you just had an ice storm and the car was parked outside and you go to turn on the wipers. That door has to raise up in order for the wipers to come on. Sometimes they would freeze up, and well, then you don't have any wipers and you'd have to figure out how to get that panel to open. So lots of different interesting things, let's say, with hidden wipers, and that's why it's number 9. Let's move to number 8. And at number 8, we're going to go with something that the big three did for a number of years, the rim blow horn. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, a lot of horn pads, you would push on the horn pad itself, and that would honk the horn. Or you'd push on some buttons on the steering wheel, and that would honk the horn. But for a number of years, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, I don't think AMC ever had a rim blow wheel. But if somebody knows that they did, put a comment in the comment section. In any case, GM, Ford, and Chrysler all had these rim blow wheels where you would pinch the inner portion of the rim, and that would honk the horn. And this was really a fad for a number of years. The thought was that you could react much faster by just not having to move your hands. You'd pinch that area of the steering wheel, and then you basically get the horn to honk faster than if you had to take your hand off the rim of the wheel and touch the horn pad, as an example. Well, the problem was that on some of these cars, the design was such that if you were trying to parallel park, you'd accidentally honk the horn, or it just ended up being annoying. And then also that soft portion of the rim that you would squeeze would end up breaking. So it was a warranty item too. It just was not a good idea, and consequently faded out after just a few years. But for a while, it at least was a seemingly good idea. It just wasn't something that was executed well, and I think most people just preferred having the horn on the horn pad in their vehicles. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the wiper control that was employed by Cadillac from the 1974 to 1979 model years. Now, Cadillac redesigned its instrument panel in its full-size vehicles for the 1974 model year to this kind of dual theme setup. In other words, the warning lights were all up top, and then you had the speedometer and then the air vents in the lower portion of the instrument cluster. But one of the things that they did when they redesigned the instrument panel was they developed this unfortunate and annoying wiper control. This super little tiny joystick that felt so cheap when you operated it. It was on the left-hand side, and you would have to use your left hand to operate it. And it was so little that it was pretty hard to operate with precision, particularly when you were going over a bumpy road. Now, the other design flaw here was that in order to activate the low, medium, and high 3-speed wipers, you would move the control up and kind of to the right a little bit. But if you wanted to activate just the delay on the wipers, you would push it to the right. So what does this mean? Let's say you were using the delay feature on the wipers for a while, and then all of a sudden the rain gets heavier. So you can't use the delay feature, and you have to switch the wipers to either the low, medium, or high setting. Well, in order to do that, you have to crash through with the control, the off position, and then move it up and to the right into the low, medium, or high position. And if you did this while the wipers were at the bottom of their position of travel, the wipers would go into their park motion, and it would take about 2 to 3 seconds before they would restart up and then activate the low, medium, and high speed. So just when you needed it, imagine you have the wipers on a delay setting, it's just kind of a light misting rain, and then the rain picks up and it becomes a torrential downpour. So you push that lever to the left, crash through the off position, the wipers go into their park motion, And now you're waiting 2 to 3 seconds for them to start back up and operate in the low and medium or high setting. It just was terrible. The control felt terrible. It was completely imprecise, hard to operate while you're driving on the road, at least if it's a bumpy road like we have in the Midwest. And like I said, had that fault associated with the park position, that the wipers would go into park if they were near the bottom end of their tread when you tried to affect that change that I mentioned from the delay setting to the low, medium, or high setting. That's why this makes the list at number 7. On to number 6. And now on to number 6. And we're back to horn controls, this time over at the Ford Motor Company with their horn control that was on the end of a lever coming off of the steering column. Now, for years, European cars had horns activated by the turn signal stalk if you push it inward, or a lever that was over there on the steering column, as opposed to pushing the horn pad. So I guess Ford probably thought it was perfectly reasonable on some vehicles to have a similarly activated horn. There was no horn pad here to depress. There were no buttons on the steering wheel to depress. You would simply push in the end of this little stalk, and that would honk the horn on your Ford vehicle, like the Lincoln Town car shown here, as well as others. And people just hated this. Ford used it for many years. I shouldn't say many years, at least I think like 5 or 6 years. It was on a number of cars like Mustangs and Escorts, and I think it just eventually annoyed so many people that they got rid of it. But they were persistent in trying to proliferate it across a number of vehicles for some period of time, and it was just annoying, and that's why it made this list at number 6. Now let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have the annoying key buzzers of classic vehicles. Now, most key buzzers today are kind of inoffensive, just a gentle bonging or beeping or something like that. But back in the day, classic buzzers were something more, and it really depends on what era your classic vehicle is from. Of course, some didn't have buzzers at all, like cars of the 50s or cars through a good portion of the 60s. But by the 70s, quite a few had some sort of key and ignition buzzer or fasten seatbelt buzzer, and they generally made annoying noises. There's the 80s era electronic GM, just steady tone that's high-pitched, that's pretty annoying, that they used for the 1980s and into the 1990s. Then there's also these various warning buzzers, the kind of mechanical sounding, just awful noises that I guess that was the intent, to get you to take your keys out of the ignition or to realize that something was happening that you should pay attention to, like your headlights are on. And I thought I would put a few samples here just so that I can remind you of how annoying these were and why it made it to number 5. And here's one from my 69 Eldorado. And from my AMC Ambassador. Oh, that was horrible. And now from my 82 Pontiac Firebird. And one last one from my 1977 9C1 Impala. You probably understand now why this made the list. Let's move on to the next item. And next at number 4, we have the decklid louvers on 1971 GM vehicles. For 1971, General Motors introduced a new flow-through ventilation system. Chevrolet called it Astro Ventilation, but it really was just, like I said, a flow-through ventilation system that would essentially allow air to come in through the cowl, flow through the passenger cabin, go through the back seat, and then come out the deck lid, louvers in the deck lid. And, well, the idea was pretty good. I mean, flow-through ventilation system, especially during this era when many people smoked, was something that could help at least get rid of the cigarette smoke from the car. The problem was in the execution. Later, General Motors and other automotive companies would put the exhaust for the cabin air in the lock pillar, where it was really shielded from debris and also from the elements. Unfortunately, these decklid louvers, as you can imagine, would attract pine needles and debris that would fall in between the inner and outer portion of the trunk. And on top of that, water would obviously flow through there. And in the wintertime, if you lived in the Midwest, it would flow through if you went in a car wash, and then it would freeze out the drains in the bottom of the deck lid, freezing the deck lid to the main portion of the car and also making it very heavy. So it just wasn't a good idea. Additionally, there were some complaints that car exhaust would kind of backdraft through those louvers, although I find that a little bit harder to believe because on these cars, one annoying feature, perhaps it should have even made this list, was that you couldn't turn the blower fan off. It was always on. Even when you put the climate control in off, the blower was on the low setting. But the reason why these are on this list is, like I said, the louvers would trap debris and water and a bunch of crap. And then, of course, well, what happens? Things rust out. And it lasted for all of 1 year on many GM vehicles. In 1972, GM would remove the deck lid louvers on many of its cars, and for good reason, and would move the exhaust I mentioned to the lock pillar, a much better location. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have the Monoleaf rear springs on the 60s era Eldorado and Tornados. Now, when the e-cars were introduced in 1966 for Oldsmobile, the Tornado, and in 1967 for Cadillac, the first front-wheel drive Eldorado, the styling of these cars, I think, is probably the best of the Bill Mitchell era GM, maybe some of the best General Motors cars ever styled. But there really was a trio of e-cars. There was the Olds Tornado, there was the Buick Riviera, and there was the Cadillac Eldorado. Interestingly, Buick selected to keep their car rear drive and on a full frame, an X frame, with 4-coil springs. However, the Tornado and Eldorado shared the same underpinnings, or I should say similar underpinnings, obviously different engines as an example, and different braking systems. But the Tornado and the Eldorado had torsion bar front suspension, a 3/4 length frame, and then Monoleaf rear springs, just a single leaf. And the rear axle was located by a total of 4 shocks to complement this Monoleaf setup. And it was about as good as it sounds. It was a terrible, terrible rear suspension for these cars. And GM did use it on other vehicles, I believe some Chevy 2s and the low-end Camaros. But I just mentioned economy cars, and the Tornado and the Eldorado were definitely not economy cars in their day. In fact, they were the priciest cars in the lineup, and they had a plebeian suspension in them, at least for the rear suspension. And unfortunately, when you drive these vehicles, it just does not endow them with a good ride. It's kind of a choppy ride, relatively boomy as well over bumps. I would say after a couple of years, Cadillac in particular had sorted it out a little bit where the impact harshness wasn't as great. But the first year, Tornado 66, and the first year Eldorado, the interior cabin noise when you're going over bumps just isn't great. And like I said, the overall ride quality isn't great. Interestingly, the Tornado and Eldorado for the next generation would go to full coil suspension, just like the Riv had from 66 to 1970. And I will say the Riv rides much better than the Eldorado and Tornado. So this Monoleaf rear spring setup was just no bueno. Number 2, let's continue. And at number 2, we're going to talk about Chevrolet motor mounts in the mid-1960s. Now, this is something that some of you may not be aware of, but Chevrolet was producing a lot of beautiful vehicles in the mid-1960s. Think about the Fastback Impala for 1965 as an example, just a stunning vehicle. But unfortunately, these mid-60s Chevrolets, some of them are endowed with motor mounts that had a tendency to break. And when they did break, it would jam the throttle cable open, and you can imagine what happened. It's basically like flooring the car and not being able to release the accelerator pedal. The only thing you could do was shift the car into neutral, in which case you probably risk grenading the engine too because it's floored and it's in neutral, or shut the key off and just have the engine turn off, which was probably the better idea. And these motor mounts lasted for several years, 1965 to 69 full-size Chevrolets, as well as Chevy 2s and the 67 to 69 Camaros. So they were around for quite a few model years before being fixed. But it got so bad that Chevrolet actually was affixing straps to the motor mounts to help hold the engine back from rocking and locking the throttle open in the event that they broke. So this design was unique to Chevrolet and clearly didn't work. And it was a safety issue, and it was recalled back in the time. And dealers were putting those new motor mounts in, or the straps that I mentioned, to try to make sure that the motor mounts didn't break. And that's one of the reasons why this is so high up on the list, because this was a genuine safety issue. And it plagued many, I would say millions of Chevrolets in the mid-1960s before it was redesigned in the latter portion of the 60s, and then it was no issue. So one thing you want to do if you have a unrestored Chevrolet from that era, be sure to check your motor mounts and that they are solid, or maybe you just want to replace them for good measure. Let's move on to number one. Number one, we have another safety issue, and that is Ford's cars that would kind of just drop in reverse. Now, Ford, for a number of years, particularly in the late 1960s, had employed a setup on their vehicles that made it very easy for the cars to shift into reverse from park. If you drive one of the Fords of this era, you'll notice that the gear selector just kind of glides through the various positions. There's not really all that strong of detents between park, reverse, neutral, and drive. You will notice that by 1972, I would say the detents get almost too strong. They're annoyingly stiff as a overcorrection to what Ford had done in prior years. But what happened is the mechanism would end up wearing out, and then oftentimes people would start their car up and warm it up. They'd get out of the car, it would be in park, and when they went to go close the door, the vibration from the door closing would sometimes pop the car into reverse. Now, the park pawl and the steering column lock that would keep the gear shift in park would tend to wear out, and then when it did, you could just move the gear selector freely from park to reverse or wherever without pulling it forward. And so one thing I would highly encourage, if you have a Ford from that time frame, kind of the mid to late 1960s, be sure that if you put it in park and you give the gear shift a light tug, it doesn't just go into reverse. I have had Fords of this era that you do that and they'll shift into reverse, no issue. And if you have one of those cars, you either want to get it fixed, which is ideal, or you just make sure that you don't leave the car running. Now, to compound matters, on the luxury cars, you'd think, well, just set the parking brake as an example, if that's true. And then if the car happens to go into gear, no big deal. The parking brake will hold it. Well, don't forget that many up-level Fords of this era, when they went into gear, it would release the parking brake automatically. So that didn't work either. Really what you have to just do if you have a Ford of this era, and I do this for mine, is don't leave them idling in park and running. Just turn the key off, shut the car off, do whatever you have to do, come back to it, restart it, and drive. But be very careful. If you ever see a Ford from the 70s or even the 60s Fords, there was a recall campaign that Ford somehow successfully lobbied, and the recall entitled them just mailing stickers to people that said, do not leave your car running in park. They didn't really fix anything. They just mailed a bunch of stickers. And you'll see some of these stickers on Ford vehicles from that 70s era. I think they were mailed in the mid-1970s. But this, to me, is kind of the top worst idea, that design that Ford had for this gear shift, because it was a safety issue and it was relatively prevalent. So be careful if you've got a Ford from that era with this style of gear shift. Hope you enjoyed this video. Did I miss any other inventions? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. And did I get the ranking right here? Thanks again for watching.